So you've heard it said before, time is money, and I cannot tell you how true that statement is. Today in the Scaling Creative Podcast, we're going to talk about efficiency. And this is a topic that I know, Mindy, you are excited about.
Why didn't I get to intro this?
We'll talk about that a little bit more in this podcast as we move on. But we're gonna right away.
It'll become more and more clear as we go forward.
Yes. No, efficiency in the workplace is something that I think is so, everyone says it's so important, but I think people don't even realize how much effort they're not putting into actually seeing if they are being efficient or not.
Right.
True.
So I think what we want to talk about a little bit in this episode is obviously some of the things that we have in place to try to stay more efficient. We're not masters of it, but I definitely am an evaluator, and with Mindy's help, we're continuing to try to figure out how we can be more efficient, because time is money. And if you're running an organization, and the bigger your organization gets, the more money is being wasted when time is being wasted. And so I think that that's what we want to talk about a little bit, talk about some tools that we use, talk about some tools that might be useful to people listening. How's everybody doing today?
Good.
Good.
Good?
Very good.
Yeah.
Very good.
It's a beautiful day today.
Gorgeous.
It is.
I'm excited. I was out with no jacket on yesterday, and just
The sunshine
the best
just
time of
does
year.
something.
I'm telling you,
Yeah.
it does. I lived in Arizona, 325 days a year of sunshine. I can promise you I was in a better mood
Yeah.
when I lived out there.
Maybe.
I'm telling you, when I wake up and it's cloudy or rainy, like, what's happy about that?
Yeah.
I mean, unless you're your wife. Your wife.
My
loves that
wife,
stuff.
I was going to say, she's the 100% opposite.
I don't know how
I don't
in
know.
the world's
Not sure why that is.
that
But
seems.
I love a good rainy day every once in a while,
sure.
but sunshine is
Not
my
me.
jam.
I love a good rainy day when I need to water my grass. That's about the only time.
I knew
And I have nowhere to be.
That's the only time I like it. But so let's dive right in. I'm gonna throw right to Mindy because
Oh,
I
boy.
know she's so excited.
I know
I
she's
know. This is
so
so much fun.
excited. I was
So-
just showing her my notes for the relationship podcast.
And it's
with
like,
the and this one is like
like
the
topic
title.
That's it.
With Mindy's name underneath it.
title. Ask Mindy.
Ask
Yeah.
me.
So let's first jump into why you even feel it's important. This seems like a dumb question, but why is it so important to actually be efficient?
Efficient, you get things done faster in a shorter amount of time with less amount of steps.
Bam. So thanks for listening to the Scaling Creative.
Yes.
Well, you have to inspect what you expect, which I think you're really good.
Truth.
A lot of people, what they get hung up on is that they love a system and they fall in love with how, and they are married to it. And it's like they don't want to separate from that. And it's the way they've always done things. And it's the way that, they feel like it's the best, or they came up with that system, and they don't necessarily reevaluate what that is and whether that is the best way to continue forward. So I always love to reevaluate, and I'm never married to anything that I do. And I always try to figure out, I always ask, is that still the best way to do things? Or has something come out that makes me think that we can do it better?
Yeah, and I think that's such a good point, because if you think about, so when I started video editing, when you start video editing, you first started with like a basic course. Here's the way that you take a clip to a timeline. For those that don't know video, that just means we're editing right now. You go through a basic form, the intro. When you learn as a child, you learn the basics.
Right.
Isn't it kind of important to evaluate things that you do on a regular basis and figure out there's no way that the basic form that I used to do it is going to be the best form forever moving forward? But I think people get married, similar to advertising, similar to the way they run a business. It doesn't matter. They get so used to doing things that they just don't want to change. And they're so, with the technology advances that we have now, it's unbelievable what type of efficiency hacks per se there are for so many aspects of business. But people just are okay with being like, well, we just did it this way. We just always did it this way. And our accountant's always done it in, QuickBooks 93, because that's what we have in our, you know what I mean? Like, it doesn't make any sense. So specifically what I want to talk about in this episode is kind of some of the tools that we use to stay efficient, or some of the ways that we're trying to continue to use tools to stay efficient, but not necessarily saying that the tool we use is the best, because it's going to really vary based on what you do. The most important thing is like why we use certain tools for different things that we do. So the first big one that I want to talk about is the communication side inside a business. I think this is one of the things that is such a waste of time with the way people communicate in a workplace. Email being one of them. I think that email is a terrible form of communication inside your company. Not just because we're huge fans of Slack, but because of the fact that everyone's email box is a disaster at all times, because everyone's email box is from a million clients with a million different people, friends, family, spam. It's just so full. The last time that I saw anyone like me that had 0 emails in their inbox, I cannot tell you the last time that I ever saw someone be that way.
I do, only because of you.
Most people have so much stuff in their email that how in the world can they, if something important comes in, are they going to see it?
Yeah.
They're not. The more and more and more noise that happens, the more that you start to tune out that noise. It was really hard for me to sleep when I first had children when they cried because it's a new noise. When you start getting used to a noise, it no longer becomes important. So if you're a person that sets way too many reminders, that tone eventually you start to dial out.
Yeah.
When we're talking about communication, I think it's important to have a company-wide communication platform and a method of how you do things. We use something called Slack, which is just phenomenal for internal communication because you have channels, you have different things of like, here's where we talk about this, here's where we talk about this. But most importantly, we have a system. Talk about communication, why it's so important.
I was just going to say, my team has always been at the smallest 40 people and has grown to around 100. And so the thing that I found with communication, good communication allows your expectations to be on the same wavelength. Because I think that's the biggest thing is when you don't communicate, your expectations might be different expectation.
Yeah, bad communication leads to mistakes and leads to things not working the way that people thought it was going to. So I think it's so important to master something that like, okay, at least that's also communication is something you can control.
Yeah.
Yeah.
People don't realize they're like, oh, well, it just kind of always is that way. Or like, Mary just doesn't do things. Or, all you have to do is communicate. And if that person can't communicate well with you, then maybe something's wrong with the person. But the least you can control is the communication with them.
And setting up the expectation of just like what that communication channel looks like is the important thing.
That's so true.
You can't expect people to communicate well or tell you something that needs to be addressed in the preferred method if they don't know what the preferred method is. All of us know from a business perspective, if it's business based, it's in Slack. If it's not in Slack, I'm ignoring it. And the only way for you to learn it's going to get ignored is it has to be ignored unless it's in the desired form.
Yeah. And I think that's the big thing is like Slack just puts it all into one place. It's kind of combining text message and emails into one big place. And when I set up one company with it, one of the best things was that we used to do a lot of it through text message and through like a group iMessage chat.
Oh boy.
And do you know how everybody knows the annoyance of when an iMessage group chat starts blowing up?
Or when it's green.
Yes.
I message people
yes. Yeah. Or when it turns green. And it's just like and it's the worst timing and all the other people that are on it decide to have some random conversation about something. It annoys us all to death.
Right.
And
then you tune it out.
And we tune it out. Yeah. And so the one thing I love is that it lets you set up your work hours. And so like when I leave work, it turns off. I can choose to check into it to see if there's something I need to do, but that's my choice.
Right.
And so that's really nice. And as Scott said, you can create channels and different lines of what groups you want to be on. And then unlike having a group email, was John on that email group that needed to be on there? Well, you don't have to worry about that because he's on that channel and on that discussion group, and everybody that needs to be on there is there.
Well, it's good for looking back on things, being able to look back at what did we talk about. Right. You can set specific reminders of like, remind me of that message another time. You can do the turning off the hours. The other cool thing about it, I feel like this is a Slack advertisement, but it should be.
Yeah.
Slack, please. We'd love to be sponsored by you.
Yeah.
But it is also good because even from an owner perspective, you guys can all do not disturb. But if I decide that something's important, I can actually bypass all your do not disturbs and still send you something. Now, as a leader, you should never take advantage of that unless it's something important. But I love knowing that you don't have to, if there was a group chat going that was nothing to do with work, but actually that is the work one, you can't turn off all your notifications for like text messages.
Right,
That's how you communicate with everybody else.
Right.
So it's whether you use Slack, whether you use WhatsApp, it doesn't really matter. I try to just think that there really should be your main communication that is unique to your company and use that for just your company.
I love the separation of it because, and I think, I don't know, it just feels like every time I talk to somebody who owns a business or is in a business, they all use texts.
Yeah.
They all use emails. It's just amazing. I'm like, how do you separate? And like, trust me, I was guilty of it.
Yeah.
I used to do that too. But having that separation, I think, just makes it so much easier because something my wife always says is clutter is just visual noise. And so when you have clutter, even in just where you live or where you work, but like in your text messages and in your emails, like how do you work?
Yeah.
You can't. It's hard, you know?
And then you really can't, like we said earlier, or maybe in the last podcast about distractions.
Right, that too.
There's no way that I can expect you to not check your text messages or check your email all the time if that's actually where I communicate with you from.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So being able to be like, hey, when you're on my clock working, the only thing that should be notifying you is Slack, knowing that I still have direct communication to you, but the world is not distracting you.
Right.
Don't expect to get distractions if you're like, we use WhatsApp. Well, maybe they use that with 1,400 other friends.
Right. Yeah.
They can't do not disturb the rest of it, but just it's just not that easy.
Right.
And so having a platform of communication is important. And then having an internal, documents or whatever you need for your company, depending on your size, of just what it looks like. When I have an issue of this, what's the way that I do it? When I have a question about this, who do I go to? Really setting that from the beginning, I think, is a foundation of actually when new people come on board, we know exactly what we need to put on computers, on phones, and say, here's how we do things. And if you have questions on it, here's where we do it.
Ask Mindy.
Here's
Ask Mindy.
but even that, as simple as like Mindy would be the person that would kind of set things up for people when they come in to make sure when we have new clients, she'll set up the Slack channels, all that kind of stuff. That's kind of the internal way that we know that we communicate, and it makes it easy. And then make sure that you train people how you use it. Don't say, we use Slack, this, and this. All right, that's it.
Good luck.
They've never used it.
Right.
You've got to instruct people
Right.
and show them what that looks like.
I think the other lie though that people will say is like, we're not that big of a company yet. But that's not, you'll never get there if you don't have the mentality of it.
Yep.
And if you get hired by some of the biggest companies out there, not that they're perfect, but they have systems in place.
Oh, yeah.
That got them to the size that they are.
Yeah.
And so if you don't have that mentality,
And it's not email, I promise you.
no way is it email.
Seriously.
Agreed. But no, if you don't have those systems in place and you don't think like that, you'll never get there.
Right.
And you have to have that in order to grow and to scale.
Yeah, because try implementing a communication system after you're big.
Oh, gosh.
Super hard.
goodness.
And also the other thing is, I think one pitfall I've heard people using with Slack is that they try to group it into having a group of people have one login.
Right.
That does not work, people.
That completely defeats the whole purpose.
It defeats the purpose.
Yeah.
Every person should have their own Slack. That it's like everybody has their own phone. You don't use one phone to have 5 people text you from, because then you would never know who that person is. And that's very important for good communication, is that one-on-one communication that you can have with other people.
Yeah, you can even make notes to yourself. Like you can write
Right.
yourself
Yeah,
notes.
I do that all the time.
Those,
Yeah.
which
Yep.
I really like doing because it separates things in my brain as well too, of like the different companies that we're
Yeah, and just
working
like
with,
social media,
clients.
you can tag people in comments,
Yes.
and it just helps them to be like,
Yeah.
hey, there may be a thread that's ongoing, but you can even mute just a certain channel temporarily because it may be like starting to get a little busy. It just allows you to really, really be able to keep things organized, but then suddenly tag someone that needs something, and that'll show up to them. Just really, really convenient in that manner. So yeah, communication, super important part of obviously keeping a company efficient. And then one of the things from there that we move on to is obviously like project management, task management. This is obviously make or break. It doesn't matter how good you communicate. If you don't keep track of what you're supposed to be doing, you're in big trouble. And this one, honestly, I think is difficult. It's difficult to say exactly what to use for sure, because as we've noticed a lot, there are so many great task management, project management, system management things out there.
Yeah.
And it is so based on industries, based on the person that is in them the most, what works for their brain, and all those pieces. So something that we use is called Asana. It's not perfect by any means. It's something we use, but that's less important than the idea of what it does. And it is project management. It's helping every person on any given day know what they're supposed to be working on, when it's due, and details about it. Because here's what takes a lot of time. If every time someone completes something in your company, they're coming to figure out what they're supposed to do next, you are wasting a lot of time. Because then it also means if they have to go check with someone what to do next and that person's busy, now they're doing no work because they're not sure what they're supposed to do. Having project management in place is vital, and then having someone that actually pays attention to it is even more vital.
It's huge, and it's also custom to, like as you were saying, to people. I've worked with a lot of people, and I've worked with Asana with one group I did, and it did not work. It wasn't the way. So we tried, and we found something else that did work, and it was successful, and we actually ended up using it, which helped them to be more productive. So really figure out, like, if something doesn't work for you, like, definitely try finding something that does. Like, it's trial and error. Don't just write it off. Please don't just write it off.
Yes.
Because it's too important. Like, it's very well known that you become more productive as a team when you use a project management software.
Oh, yeah.
So, and it's all about how you organize it and how you, and it's once again, setting up that ground basis for your team to know how it operates and how it works and what is the workflow of it.
Yes, the workflow. Yep.
And that is very, very important, because if you don't know that steps and that process of how you get through things, then your team's not going to be doing it correctly.
Yeah, there's a lot of companies that are super inefficient, and it's not even the worker's fault. It's that there's no way for them to be more efficient, because you can't. The workers can't set up like their own type of system of how they're going to keep track. I mean, they can to a point, but like as an organization, you should. And then paying attention to things like integration between apps is a huge deal.
Right.
Huge deal to someone like me, because I really don't want to have to jump around all the time. So as much as you can find things that work together is great, but you have to figure out what's right for you. I'm a visual person that likes to be able to just see things, like something as simple as color coding and the way things look play a huge role into like how it feels. Because if it looks messy, it is messy to me. Even if it's not, it's got to look clean. Something to me that's important is like, if you don't have a really good iPad app, iPhone app, and computer app, you also have no chance. Simply because the way that I work, I use those devices so much, and it needs to be as efficient and clean and beautiful everywhere.
Everywhere.
Because the most frustrating thing to me is when I leave an environment and I suddenly only have a phone with me. If I can't do everything I can do other than like video editing on the computer, now that doesn't seem efficient to me. So that's a big piece. So like with our type of system, the way that we would do it is we have something called Asana, and what that allows you to do is put tasks in, put subtasks in, all underneath things, but you can assign certain tasks to certain people with certain due dates. You can comment on things, you can have descriptions of things. So it's laid out so that when Pablo comes into work and he sees a task, the description should tell him what that task is. Some details about it, links to things he needs to reference if that's what it is. But you should be able to answer those questions for people so that as you just throw task and task and task, it's reminding him, but it's also good for you. Because when you're assigning hundreds of tasks a week, if someone comes to you and like, what am I supposed to be doing for this project? You may forget what that even was. So it helps the project manager as well to put it in place when it's fresh on their mind with the due date, with the info, with the assignment, so that when they reference something or they suddenly comment, hey, do you know if this is supposed to blah, blah, blah? And you're like, I don't even remember what the heck you're working on. It's really, really, I think, important for that. And it's something that you kind of do have to get used to, because the thing that we've talked about a lot is everyone personally has different ways that they remember things, but it doesn't mean that they're not using Asana for us. If you need to have your own systems in place, you can do that as much as you want. but it's understanding that the company you work for is really what you have to work in their guidelines, which some people, you're much more of a pen and paper type of person.
Yeah.
And so it's like, if you work really well with those things inside that's fine. But it doesn't mean that like, okay, Michaela prefers pen and paper, so as a company, we feel like we should also use pen and paper. It's like, that's not going to happen.
Right.
Right.
So it's a matter of working in the system.
I think people just get so comfortable, the C word, and they don't realize that when you're in a business, in a growing business, there's very few things that are going to remain as one and done. But people are very addicted to that idea of like, oh, I want it to be a one-stop shop and it's just always going to work this way. But the problem is you're growing, which means they're changing, which means you need to learn how to change with it. And so I think with this kind of a thing right now, we're using Asana and it works and it does what we need it to do. But we may use other forms of doing this. But I think the one thing that I really appreciate about both of you, Mindy and Scott, is that you guys evaluate. You stop and think about it. You look into. That's something I don't naturally do. I kind of just, if it's working, you're doing it. But there may be a more efficient way to do it. There may be a better way to do it. And I think if you're in a business owner and you're not looking at that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I was going to say, the important thing is it's not your job as an employee it's the project managers and the bosses or however your organization is set up. They're the ones that need to evaluate. The evaluation needs to happen from the top.
Everything
Yes,
starts at the top.
It has
really.
to. Yes.
Yeah. And I think too, the other big thing is that yes, there's upper management that needs to look at that, but also talk to your employees, figure out where the pitfalls are, because people can make a decision, but it's going to break down in your team if they don't understand it, or if there's something about what they do that it doesn't really work for. And so that's the one thing I always try to do is evaluate things and talk to people who are actually using it to figure out if that is the best way to do something, because I might be creating a problem,
Right.
a bigger problem and a bigger issue than that needs to be. And it was like, oh, if I would have known that, then we could have done it this way, and it would have been 5 times easier.
I think a quick point on evaluation too. I think just because we're talking about evaluation doesn't mean that every single time you evaluate, you need to change something.
Right.
Not every time.
Oh, yeah.
But I think being open to change
Oh,
and
yeah.
being open to also not change if something's working.
Oh, yeah.
But just kind of remembering, like, we're not saying you have to change every single time. 'Cause
right.
Yeah. On our
Crazy.
podcast two weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, we had someone comment and ask about the fact that like how do you actually stay, because her struggle was when she evaluates, she's trying to be so efficient that she's not being efficient at all.
Oh, wow.
And I think it was a great point, because I agree that can also sometimes be my problem.
Yeah.
Because I'm so about efficiency that if I edit, I'm like, I know I'm doing like the fastest shortcut ever, but is it possible there could be an even faster way?
There's gotta be something.
And then I'm just tied up so much in that I'm like not actually doing any work.
Exactly. And that's
But it's a balance.
It is
balance,
a balance.
yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think that's something that I always look at is it's like what I'm trying to do research on and trying to make more efficient. Am I actually taking more time
Right.
by trying to make something more efficient than to keep on doing what I'm currently doing?
Yep.
And sometimes it is just to keep doing what you're currently doing. Or if you can't figure out a way to be more efficient in something, put it to the side.
Yeah.
And there's oftentimes that I've put something that I've tried to make more efficient to the side. And a year later, I picked it back up. One, either technology came out that allowed me to create that more efficient step that needed to be,
Yep.
or that the team was there then to be more like your team might not be where you're at, and also be aware of that. And sometimes it's like you need to hold off if you've just done 20 things that are new to your hold off on adding in another system, because that's just too overwhelming.
Because I think even unorganized people actually would prefer to be organized. They just don't really know how to do it. And so if from a management perspective, you can at least put the things in place to allow people to be efficient, then it gives them less excuses to not be. An unorganized person in an unorganized workplace is just ridiculously unorganized.
Organized, yeah.
An unorganized person in an unbelievably organized place is going to be much better than they were without being naturally organized. And so putting those things in place. And then, I think the way that I evaluate things of like, can I do something better, is I really try to think about what things do I do all the time? Like from an editing perspective, if I always, this is going to go into editing things, so it probably won't make sense to you. That's okay. If I do the same things all the time, like mark in points, out points, edit down, and all these little things that I do every project, every single time, I'm always going to do them. I need to make those unbelievably efficient. And the things that I don't do that often, I'm only going to be so efficient at anyway. But trying to evaluate, most people, if you're honest, like you do the same things in your work all the time to a point. Like if it's in a certain software, if it's in a certain way that you text, whatever it is, trying to evaluate what's taking up the most amount of my time, then can I do something more efficient in that spot, I think helps a lot. Because even if you do multiple things at your jobs, something as simple as like, anyone that knows me knows I'm like a shortcut machine. So I'm always trying to think of the fastest way to open things.
Yeah.
But Pablo would agree that some of the things that I've taught him to do from a shortcut standpoint that seems so like, okay, whatever, I got to remember that. When done 100 times a day or week or millions of times a year, if it saves you 2 seconds,
It's time.
That adds up.
but it adds up to a minute per hour,
yeah.
that's 10 minutes a day, whatever, it still adds up.
Yeah.
And I think that the more and more that you can look for just efficiency in the things that you do all the time and talk to people that are very efficient and be like, is there an easier way? That's why most times like I'm over the top of anyone's shoulder. I instantly do something. I'm like, Command C, Command blah, blah. I'm just a program in your brain like, hey, just so you know, there is an easier way.
Yeah.
It takes time to get used to, but
Yeah, it does.
then you start using it, you're like, I cannot believe I used to every single minimize my window instead of hiding it. And like just
I've learned so many little things already, and I'm not a naturally organized person, but even like in my house, I have a friend who's incredibly organized. And I said to her, like, it's just like not the way that my brain thinks, but if somebody organizes for me, I can maintain it.
right.
So even in my house, she's helped me with certain things. Like when I set up my kitchen, she helps me organize things, and then I can maintain it from there. But it's just not naturally within my gifting. And so sometimes it's better to hire somebody or have somebody help you in that area
Yep.
and get you set up at least.
Someone that's doing it already in your industry.
Yeah.
It's a great resource. Look at people like we talked about before. Look at people that are in your industry, bigger than you, doing similar stuff. Because chances are they have a good system in place.
Yes.
Or at least better than you probably do.
Yes.
Or else they wouldn't probably grow in the first place.
Yeah.
I think it's just-
don't let your pride get in the way
Yes.
Right.
of asking.
That's a good point.
for it.
I think it's just good. Like I'm addicted to the idea of having a clean plate. Like, and so like one thing that has helped me is that like, you know, when you arrive early somewhere and you have like you're early, which means you have time to think and process and prepare for that. I'm still working on that because that's something that like I naturally struggle with is being on time. But I've learned that feeling of when you are early and you are prepared, you have a clean slate to start. And so I've learned that like in the same ways that if you can end early, if you can have a clean plate from a project so that you can be prepared for the next project, the only way you can get there quickly is if you're efficient. And I've learned that when you can arrive at that place quicker and quicker and quicker, that means you can do actually more and more and more things. And so I love the ability of having a clean slate, but you can't do that with clutter. You can't do that with inefficiency. It just doesn't work.
And from a leadership perspective, this goes specifically to people that manage people or a boss. You are the person that determines, and you are the person that's going to set an example of what you expect in an unbelievable way. Anyone that knows me knows that time is my biggest. You being a minute late changes an entire perspective. But here's the thing. I can't tell you to be on time if I am not unbelievably on time with everything we do. I can't tell you when I used to do stuff at the church to be prepared if I'm not already prepared. The amount of people that I talk to or leaders or managers that are like, yeah, that person's always late. And I'm like, why are they always late? It's your job to change them being late. Meaning, first of all, employees, if you, and this is not saying that to anyone in this room in general, but when you work at 9 o'clock, You work at 9 o'clock, meaning you're supposed to be ready to work at 9 o'clock, meaning you always should be getting somewhere early enough so that at 9 o'clock you're ready to work. As a manager, if you have someone that, and I'm doing air quotes, is always late, you know it's your fault because you're allowing them to always be late.
Right.
If they're always late and you never say anything, they're never going to stop always being late. If they're always not doing communication the way you prefer and you say, yeah, they're just not good with Slack, it's your fault. It's your job to take someone that might not naturally do something the way you do in your organization, and you have to change it. If you let a child keep misbehaving, what does a child keep doing? They keep misbehaving. It doesn't mean that when you say it once, they're going to stop, but they have to know that every single time they misbehave, there is a consequence to misbehaving, and that's the only way they learn. But parents that a kid flips out in a restaurant and they're like, just give him the iPad. You think that kid's not learning? You think your employee is not learning that when they're 6 minutes late, it's not that big of a deal, and then it eventually becomes 10, and then eventually becomes 15, and then they're 15 minutes late, but they still clock out at the same time? Do you think they're not learning that they are actually working 15 minutes less every day, and they're not learning that it's okay to be a little late, it's okay to be a little behind at a task? They're learning. That's what humans do. They learn what you expect, and then they keep doing the same stuff until you make the decision to say enough is enough. So don't use that lame excuse that people are doing things that you don't want them to do if you're letting them.
And starting it sooner.
Immediately,
Like,
yes.
Yeah, like implementing it right away is something that's really important.
Yeah. And I would say like, and it's worth taking time because a lot of people say that they're so busy that they don't have time to take the time to actually organize and to get it because they'll get to it someday when they have some time to do it. And you don't have time not to do it.
And I think doing those things in advance. So like one thing I've learned too that's really helped me is like I have a series of things that I do every morning when I wake up. I want to go work out. I want to like have a devotional time. I want to like do all these things. And I've learned that setting yourself up the night before can make you efficient in the morning. And so the same thing goes for working as well. I'm learning now more as time goes on. I'm still like 25, so I'm learning things in life. But as I'm learning that like if I can actually end my day, so sometimes when I leave work, before I like move on to the next thing with whether it be, I don't know, anything, just an evening activity, even before dinner, I'll like look at what I did that day and what I have to do the next day in my head. And I'll start to think like, okay, and I'll write them down and make sure like, okay, and then you'll actually wake up the next day and you'll be ready for when you do show up on time, working on it. But like, that you'll be ready to do those things, you know, and that's something that's helped me a lot is just to not constantly be just like, okay, when I'm at work, I'm only thinking about it, but like you try and just prepare yourself so that you're mentally prepared for the next day.
It's about preparing for it. It's like you said, it's just about realizing that you can't just you can naturally be an organized person, whatever, but everything takes work. Like it takes work to make sure that you're efficient and to make sure that you're organized and all that kind of stuff. But it takes you realizing that you need to actually put systems in place for yourself. There are a lot of people that will say like, oh, I don't have time to work out, or I don't have time to do this, time to do that. But if it was like a vital part to you living, you'd find time to do it. And people just waste a lot of time.
Yep.
You have to, if you're going to go to the gym every day, you probably need to do it at the same time all the time, whatever that looks like to you. And you need to just actually have it as something that you realize is so important and needs to happen. The problem is everyone tries to like throw more things into their day without actually putting a system in place. And then you can't find the time. You can't. We talked about relationships in the last episode. Like I can't hope that I'm just suddenly going to find more time in a day to talk or connect with someone I haven't connected with. I have to make it a point and say, it's in my calendar. I have time. A guy I used to work with that used to be like a boss of mine said he used to like put his calendar and it would say like lunch with someone on his calendar, and then he'd fill who that was each week or twice a week or whatever. You've got to put time aside to do things. Don't just expect it to fall into place.
Right.
It's a big piece of being efficient. So the last thing to touch on is something I think is very important. In the same way that it's important as an organization to have good communication with each other and setting up what that system looks like, you need your clients to know how the process works with you as well. And from a professional standpoint, it is much more professional when you have a new client and to say, here's what to expect, whether it's a document, whether it's a video, something we're working on is internal training videos of like, here's how we always do things. Clients love when we are like, hey, we use this program and this is kind of how we send files to look at. They love it because they're like, this is so much easier for me.
Yeah.
It's not a good idea, in my opinion, to just go in and be like, what's best for you? Not about that you don't care about what works for them, but they're okay with following your systems.
Right, because you're the expert.
Yeah, they're hiring you and they're not expecting that like you're just going to do everything how they always did.
Yeah.
But having a system and saying, here's how we do things. When you need to request filming, here's the way we do things. When you need edits, when we're going to send you approvals for things, here's how you do it. Here's the person to contact for this. Here's who you can expect to listen to from there, but we don't do that. People like it.
Yeah.
It's not about changing everything they're used to. It's about just saying, this is how we do things.
It's literally your job.
Yeah.
Like it's not their job to create your systems.
Yeah.
It doesn't work that way. They're hiring you to do a job. You have to have systems in place for them.
Yep.
That's the least you can do is actually create those systems.
It's like Apple. When I buy an iPhone or when I have an issue, I don't go in and say like, I prefer to just text someone. Like, is it okay if I just text someone when I have an issue? No. They say, no, you need to set up a Genius Bar appointment. When there's a time, you need to come and do it. That you may hate that because that's not your preferred, but it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
They're setting the expectation of when you have issues, here's the process that it has to be. If you don't want to come in, we have another process, but it's going to be the whatever it is.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't determine their system.
Right.
And regardless whether you're Apple size or not, it doesn't matter.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I used to give people too many options too, like within my makeup business of, oh, you can order, you can text me, you can email me, you can Facebook, like whatever you want to do.
Yeah.
And then things get lost
Yeah.
and I become inefficient and therefore my customer service isn't good. Like there's when you have so many options, there are so many options for things to fall through the cracks.
Yep.
Right.
And so like kind of bringing it down and narrowing it to, this is what I do.
Yeah.
This is how you order. So that way I have one thing and I'm efficient. And even though, because I've always thought to myself, well, what's more convenient for them? But what's convenient for them is getting their order.
Yeah, and that's I think people are too worried about like them being like, oh, well, that's just not natural to me. I think that people are much more receptive to like an orderly system for you. It's different. Everyone that I, internet, phone, cell phone, all that kind of stuff. Every company I work for, they have their own system.
Yeah.
I fall into it because that's what I expect.
Yeah. And
so you should do that as well.
Overwhelmed mind does nothing.
Yeah.
Right.
So.
Yep.
I think it's very true. And I think too, especially for if you're a smaller business, sometimes there is some catering to specific clients that you work with that is not out of your system. So don't be so committed to the way you're doing things that you lose somebody because you're not willing to change to meet their specific need and how they operate. Because a part of being a great customer service company to other people is to know them. And like as our last podcast, we talked about being relationships. This is that's a very important part to know how they communicate. So it's like we might have a set standard of channels that we'll set up on Slack to communicate with a client, but sometimes those don't work with that client. And so we need to adjust what they are to be better. And so to always readjust and realign because you'll be running better.
Yeah, and then I think it's also important. Yeah, you're going to have that client that does things a little different. And then it's up to you to say, okay, well, this is not going to work for them at all. But here's how we need to make sure that even though this is what they do, our system internally still needs to make sure we keep up with them. Because if they prefer a certain form of communication and certain form of approval process and they're not going to change it, no, it'd be silly for us to be like, well, it's this way or the highway. But at the same time, they're also not going to just be like, oh, well, I understand you forgot to do the work because I didn't use your preferred. No, they're going to be like, you forgot to do the work.
Yeah.
So it's up to you that if you take on the client that does things differently, realize it is up to you to figure out how their method is going to work. And I would say that's the rare, luckily it's more rare than it is the normal, but it happens. And like, no, don't lose work over it, but you better make sure that you still stay organized in their method.
It's also not being afraid to let go of some clients if you need to. That's a whole nother conversation. But it's just, sometimes you need to like bounce and not break. You know, like you don't want to break a relationship just because maybe they don't do things the way you do them. You have to be flexible, but at the same time, you have to have your funnel, your system that people need to funnel through. And you can't just let other people create your systems for you. You're flexible, you work with them, but sometimes it's okay to let clients go if you have to.
Yeah. That's
That's a whole nother conversation. But still.
On next episode, when to let go of your client.
Yeah.
No, but I think efficiency is just unbelievably important. Communication, efficiency, all that. Time is money. It's absolutely true. And I think anyone listening to this would probably agree. And hopefully this will kind of just spark some interest of just evaluating some things. So I think it first just starts with an outsider perspective. One thing I ask, of Mindy all the time is because she's fairly new is like, I want someone that's very organized to just look and say, you see what I do on a regular basis. What can we improve?
Yeah.
You may be an unbelievable boss, but a terrible planner. When you bring in someone that's very organized, let them help you organize. Don't tell them this is how you do it.
Right.
If hire smart people and let them continue to be smart where they are and just evaluate how can you do things better, because as you grow more and more, this becomes even harder to implement. And also even harder, it wastes even more money. Because now the 1 minute that's wasted, but you times it by the whole company, ends up being quite the hassle. So would love to know your productivity hacks, your efficiency hacks. So comment below, send us a DM. Would love to know, do you use some of the similar stuff that we do? Maybe use something better. We'd love to hear about it. Also, one quick note for those who listen to our podcast regularly, next week we will not have a podcast. A bunch of us are traveling and we're at the office, and so it's going to be a little impossible for us to do that remotely. So I know that you are so sad right now, but there will be no podcast next week. We will be back the following week, and we look forward to catching back up with you. If you haven't listened to some of the old podcasts, now's a great time to do that. If not, then you just saved yourself an hour of time. See you next week.